Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each episode of this podcast alternates between an interview with a guest or multiple guests and a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship. In the interview that released right before this with Phil Bagg, Phil mentioned wanting to learn more about questions and questioning techniques, so I included some resources in the show notes. One of the resources that I included was an article that we discussed at Boot Up, which was on using a process called cognitive guided inquiry to stimulate mathematical thinking. Now, the way that we talked about it internally at Boot Up was how can we take these kinds of questions and apply them to think computationally? So what I'm going to do today, instead of unpacking an article, is I'm going to actually unpack two different articles that are related to cognitive guided inquiry and talk about how you could use these kinds of questions to think computationally. Now, as always, in the show notes, you can find direct links to the articles that I am mentioning, and these articles are free. So if you click on the title in the show notes, it will take you directly to the articles so you can check these out. Also in the show notes are links to the other podcast episodes that I've done that are related to questioning techniques, and those also include more resources and questions that can assist with thinking computationally. So make sure you check those out by going to the link that's in the description for the app that you're listening to this on, or by simply going to jaredoleary.com. Now, when you're on the website, make sure to check out the other links that are on there, because there are hundreds of resources for computer science educators, as well as percussionists, if you happen to play the drums, including a link to the free curriculum that I create for Scratch and Scratch Junior at Boot Up. So if you haven't checked that out yet, I highly recommend doing so. All right, so the first article that I want to talk about is by Jenny Wei, and it is titled Using Questioning to Stimulate Mathematical Thinking. So the author poses 4 different types of questions that can assist with mathematical thinking. So the first one being starter questions, the next one's being questions to stimulate mathematical thinking, the next one is assessment questions, and then final discussion questions. So what I've done is I've gone in and read through the questions in there and reframed them in a way that would make sense for computer science or computational thinking. But I didn't reframe all of them, so make sure you actually check out the article, which is again linked to in the show notes. All right, so the first set of questions, starter questions. So here are some examples of some questions that you might be able to use in a coding or computer science class. The one question might be, how many ways can we solve this bug or problem? Another question could be, what happens if we reverse the order of this algorithm? And another question might be, what kind of project can we create with conditionals? Now, similar to the question podcasts that I've done in the past on like open, guided, and closed questions, these are more guided or open questions to kind of stimulate dialogue and to think through different possibilities. In other words, to think through what could be, or what might happen, or what if. So the next set of questions to stimulate computational thinking. Here are some examples. When looking at 2 different projects or chunks of code, what's the same? What's different? What patterns do you notice? If you were to break this down into different pieces, how would you group or label each part of the code? What do you think comes next in the code and why? What do you think comes before this code and why? So not only is it beneficial to think about what would come next and like how to expand upon things, build off of things, but it's also to think through, what would need to happen before this algorithm or function in order to make it actually work? So these questions really dive deeper into analyzing what's going on and better understanding what is there and what could be or what came before it. Now, the next set of questions is the assessment questions. And so some examples, these are directly from the article, are what have you discovered? How did you find that out? Why did you think that? And what made you decide to do it that way? So these are excellent assessment questions. Now, if you go into the show notes, you'll find the other podcasts that I've done where I've talked about other different types of assessment questions that I encourage in the lessons that I create for Boot Up. So every single one of the lesson plans at Boot Up, which there's like 100 of them, includes formative assessments, summative assessments, and ipsative assessments. So if you're not familiar with each of those 3, or like some examples of them, make sure you check out the show notes or check out the lesson plans at bootuppd.org, as they all include examples of each of those 3, and they all link to a document that specifically unpacks assessment questions some more. All right, so in this article, the next set is the final discussion questions. So these kind of questions might be posed as like a form of reflection at the close or near the close of a project or class. And they include questions like, who solved the bug or problem in a similar way? Who has a different solution or algorithm? Do we all have the same code? Why or why not? Are there other ways to solve this bug or problem? How do you know there are or are not? How is or isn't your solution the best solution? What is it the best at? And what do other algorithms do better than the one that you chose? So these are all excellent ways of reflecting on and thinking through and evaluating code, but it could certainly apply to computer science and other topics relevant, not just to programming. All right, so the next section of this article talks about levels of mathematical thinking. So I'm going to translate it into levels of computational thinking. And so these 7 levels are memory, translation, interpretation, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. So while the author poses 4 different categories of questions, these are different types of questions that can be used. Similar to the previous podcast that I did that was talking about like judicial questions. So this is very similar in terms of the thinking that's involved with this. But instead of being for music and translating it to computer science, this is for mathematics and we're translating it to computer science. All right, so the first level is memory, which is what the student recalls or has memorized for information. So a question that you might ask is like, what projects or code have you previously worked on that might assist with this bug, problem, or project? Asking a question like that helps them recall prior things that they've worked on and might assist with what they're about to work on next. So the next one, translation. So this is when you translate the information into a different form or a different language. So for example, translating the code into something that somebody would understand who hasn't learned how to code yet. So some questions you might ask would be something like, without showing your code to someone, how would you explain how this works? Or you could ask, how would you explain it if the other person didn't know how to code but wanted to understand how your code worked? So the next level is interpretation. So this is where students will basically understand the different relationships that exist between their code and other code. So for example, you might ask questions like, when looking at another person's algorithm, can you explain what's similar and different between your algorithm and theirs? What patterns do you notice? How could you group your code or functions differently? So questions like that get them to compare not only code with other people's code, but also their own code and thinking through different ways of grouping things, like different functions or different chunks of code or whatever. All right, so the next level is application. So this is basically being able to identify a problem and finding a way to solve that problem. So applying the understanding to solve something or create something. So for example, you could ask questions like, how does your code solve the bug or problem? You could also ask what code should come next and why. So that not only gets them to think about application in the current context, but also future context for what's next. So the next level of computational thinking is analysis. So this is basically when you are thinking through and trying to understand how you learned how to solve that problem and what you learned from it. So some example questions might be, what did you discover or learn in this algorithm? Or how did you figure that out? Or why do you think that? Or what made you decide to order your algorithm that way and not another way? These all get kids to analyze what they're doing and what they're creating through code. The next level is synthesis. This is basically when you combine your understandings in creative or original ways. You synthesize to solve a problem or create something. And so questions might be, who has a different solution to the bug or problem? And are their answers the same as yours? Why or why not? Or asking questions like, how did your understandings from prior projects or bugs inform your code for this project, problem, or bug? So getting kids to think through how their prior understandings kind of work together or synthesize to solve this current bug or problem, or to create something new and interesting. And then the last level is the evaluation. So this is where you are making some judgments on what is good or best or right or wrong, according to whatever kind of measure or standard you're going with. So some example questions you might ask is, have we found all the possible solutions to the bug or problem? How do we know if we have? Are there other ways to solve the bug or problem? What is this solution the best at, and what is it not the best at? For example, this algorithm might be really good at sorting something and coming to a, large to small sorting, but it takes a very long time, so it's really bad at that. But the result is great. So thinking through and evaluating, well, what is this good at, what is this not good at, it really helps kids to kind of understand their code or what they are creating. All right, so that's a lot of example questions. And in the show notes, I include the questions on there just to kind of help translate the mathematical thinking into the computational thinking. So make sure you check out the show notes to see the questions written there. You don't have to listen to this over and over. You can just literally copy and paste these and use them as a cheat sheet. Now, the other article by Jenny Pennant, it's titled Developing a Classroom Culture That Supports a Problem-Solving Approach to Mathematics. So rather than just providing a bunch of different questions to think through and types of questions, it's actually thinking about the overall process that you use with questioning techniques in your class. So for example, it begins with the discussion on who does all the talking in whole class parts of the lesson. So a great thing to do would be to record yourself, maybe just the audio, maybe the video as well, and to analyze how your own teaching is. So thinking through, how much time am I spending talking and how much time are kids able to speak? What about a specific individual? So if you were to watch a single student through the entire recording and try and analyze the amount of time that they spent speaking compared to their peers and compared to you, it would be a really good way to potentially realize, oh, wow, I'm talking a whole lot more than I thought. Or, oh, wow, these kids are not very engaged as much as I think they were. And when you are analyzing your own speech, try and analyze how many times you're actually responding with a direct answer or when you're responding with a question. As I've mentioned before, I tended to respond to questions with questions because I didn't want to give an answer. I wanted kids to think through and kind of uncover or discover the answer through some guided questioning techniques that I talked about in other episodes and some of the questions that I even mentioned earlier in this podcast. Now, when you are asking questions, the next aspect that the author recommends is to think through what kind of questions do you ask. So the previous questions that I mentioned would be really helpful for this. So for example, thinking through the different stages. This author also mentions those stages as well. And then also thinking through the different levels of thinking, which the author also mentions as well in this particular article. So make sure you check out this second article so you can see even more examples of different questions or the different levels and the different types of questions that I already mentioned. All right, so the next aspect that the author recommends looking at is who answers the questions. So thinking through the full range of, is it one kid who's answering? Is it everybody who's answering? How many voices are able to speak at the same time, etc. If it's a full group discussion and only one person gets to talk at a time, and maybe you have 30 kids in the class, odds are you're not going to be able to have it so that everybody's able to share their understanding and answer or ask questions. But if you are doing like think, pair, share, maybe there are more opportunities for kids to answer the questions to a neighbor. And the author provides some examples of how you can encourage this or things to try when it comes to who is answering the questions. Make sure you check out the actual article. All right, so the fourth aspect to consider is how well do I listen to the students' answers and seek to understand what they are saying? So the author recommends approaching this from a curiosity and to even ask clarifying questions like, so it sounds like you're saying blah, blah, blah. Or even asking kids to talk to a partner and have that partner relay back what they think they heard. Now, sometimes when a kid provides an answer, they might have some gaps in their understanding, and it's not safe to assume necessarily what that gap is and whether they understand that missing information. So ask some clarifying questions to really understand, oh, do they understand that piece of information that they left out? Do they leave it out because they know it really well and don't need to think about it? Or do they leave it out because they're actually not thinking about it and don't understand it fully, but they just happen to get a correct answer? And don't even assume about an incorrect answer. So the author provides a really good example of how a student solved a question incorrectly, a mathematical equation. And when asking follow-up questions, they realized that the student solved an answer correctly. It was just the wrong question or problem that they were solving. So I highly recommend actually reading out the little transcript that they provide in there. Because sometimes a student might listen to your question and go, oh, I think what they're asking is this, and they'll provide an answer to that, and the answer might be correct, but you're really asking for something else, so it comes across as if they don't understand what you're asking. All right, so aspect 5 is, what do I do with the students' answers? So rather than immediately responding to an answer and saying, yeah, that was great, or no, that was incorrect, you could ask questions of the other students, or just simply be quiet and see how other people respond to it. If you are going to respond, you can thank for the contribution to it, but then follow up with more questions. Are you sure? Or can you convince me? Or show me how you know that? Etc. To really get kids to think through their answers and not just guess randomly. All right, so aspect 6 is, how do I facilitate the learning? Now, the author provides a couple of links to some other suggestions on how to facilitate, including like peer teaching or peer feedback from another colleague, deciding on areas that you want to improve with your own teaching or facilitating, and doing so in relation to the actual structure of the lesson or the overall goal or point. So in this section, the author provides some more suggestions for the prep work, during the work, and the reflection time at the end, or diving deeper. So I highly recommend taking a look at the tips in there. All right, so aspect 7 is, how confident are the students to take a risk, try out ideas, and make mistakes? So the author provides some suggestions for how to actually dive deeper into this and feel safe by exploring alternatives or different ideas that they might not have thought of if they weren't encouraged to do so. So instead of trying to find the right answer and avoiding the wrong answers, think through what are some other ways or other possibilities. Even if I end up failing, my project ends up not working, what can I learn through this process and go, oh, that's not how I want to animate a sprite in Scratch or something like that. Instead, I want to do it this other way. Sometimes it's good to learn what not to do, as it will inform what you do in future projects. So encouraging that problem solving and debugging and iteration and failure, etc., and learning from all those experiences. Then the last aspect that the author mentions is, what does my body language communicate? This is something that I realized when I started working with kids and videotaping my own teaching, is I just naturally look really angry. I don't know if it's all the years on Drumline or the fact that I tend to think really hard very often, but my thinking face, my resting face, looks upset. So I realized that I had to engage in ways with kids that made it very clear, no, I'm not mad, I'm just thinking. And so I would be extra goofy. Now with the adults that I meet, I seriously, like in the Zoom conferences that I meet, or when I first meet somebody, and I know it's going to be like a conversation where I'll be thinking a lot, I'll have to give a disclaimer like, hey, just an FYI, I might look upset, but I promise I'm just thinking. Being aware of that can make a huge difference. And sometimes when I forget to mention that, I've had kids come up to me and be like, are you okay? Are you upset? And then I usually have to just laugh it off and go, no, I promise, I'm just thinking. I'm great. So if you haven't videotaped yourself, turn off the sound and maybe even watch it in fast forward, as it really kind of exaggerates the emotions. And just watch yourself. How are you communicating non-verbally? It's something that I learned a lot from, and I highly recommend, and the author also highly recommends as well. All right, so that's a very quick overview of the two different articles that are related to cognitive guided inquiry. And I applied it to computational thinking or computer science. Again, I highly recommend checking out both these articles. All right, so at the end of each of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I love to share some of my lingering questions or thoughts. And I have two questions for this particular one. So one of them is, what levels or types of computational thinking questions are different than the mathematical thinking discussed in this article? So what was missing? While it's clear to me that the different levels of thinking are very applicable to computational thinking, but I'm wondering what is unique to computational thinking that might not have been evident in the levels of mathematical thinking. And I genuinely don't know, so if you do, feel free to reach out. Another question that I have is, what other question types, levels, or techniques from other disciplines might inform the kinds of questions we ask in a computer science class? So the previous Unpacking Scholarship episode that I did titled Talking About Computer Science, Better Questions, Better Discussions, that one was based off of a music education article. The articles that I just kind of briefly talked about today were from mathematics. So what other disciplines might inform computer science or computational thinking questions that we could ask? For example, what could we learn from language arts? What could we learn from social studies? What could we learn from the fine arts, etc.? And if you have some suggestions on some articles that I could read, feel free to press the contact me button on my website. Let me know. I'll happy to unpack it here. All right, so that's a very quick overview of two articles and some of my lingering questions and thoughts. Again, you can find the show notes by going to jaredoleary.com, clicking on the podcast tab, or simply going to the link in the app that you're listening to this on, where you will find links to the other podcasts that I mentioned on questioning techniques, and you will find all the questions that I read off listed at the bottom of the show notes. If you found this episode useful, I just ask that you share it with others. Engage in discussion. Maybe use the CSK8 hashtag on Twitter and share some other questions that you really like to ask that have led to some great conversations in the classes that you work with. I hope you found this episode useful, and I hope you're having a safe and wonderful week. Thank you so much for listening.